The first indication that something had gone wrong was not the signal itself, it was the delay. According to the mission log, the transmission from station S17 was scheduled to arrive at exactly 0314 UTC. When it didn't, the delay was initially dismissed as atmospheric interference. That happened often enough to avoid raising concern. But when the signal arrived 37 seconds late and carried data that did not match the outgoing parameters, the anomaly was formally recorded. At the time, this seemed insignificant. Station S17 was part of a long-term monitoring network designed to observe low-frequency disturbances in a region officially classified as inactive. The zone had shown no measurable activity for over a decade. No seismic events, no electromagnetic irregularities, no biological indicators. The area had been labeled stable, predictable, and safe. That designation would later be revoked. The outgoing transmission had been simple, a calibration pulse, standard amplitude, no encoded information. What returned, however, was not an echo. It was structured, layered, and slightly altered. Technicians noted that the waveform had gained depth, as if the signal had passed through something dense before returning.
The distortion did not resemble atmospheric scattering or geological refraction. It suggested interaction. No one could identify what the signal had interacted with. A second pulse was sent 12 minutes later. This time, the response arrived faster than expected. Too fast. The data packet contained fragments that had not been transmitted, frequency patterns that did not exist in the original signal. Someone suggested a software error. Another blamed sensor drift. No one suggested an external response. By 0402 UTC, a third transmission was authorized. This decision would later be questioned. The third signal never returned. Instead, station S17 began transmitting autonomously. No command had been issued, no override was active, yet the system entered a continuous broadcast mode, emitting a low-frequency pattern that did not correspond to any known protocol in the network. The pattern was given a temporary designation for tracking purposes, set a reel. At the time, it was assumed to be a malfunction. That assumption would not survive the next 6 hours. The autonomous transmission continued for 6 minutes before anyone attempted to interrupt it. When the override command was issued, the system acknowledged receipt, but did not comply.
Instead, the signal shifted. The frequency dropped by a narrow margin, subtle enough to be missed without focused monitoring, yet deliberate enough to suggest adaptation rather than error. At this point, the control team stopped referring to the event as a malfunction. Analysis of the live data revealed repetition. Not loops, but sequences, patterns that returned with slight variation, each iteration more refined than the last. The signal appeared to be learning its own structure as it transmitted, correcting inconsistencies, tightening intervals, reducing noise. This behavior had no precedent in the archive. An internal memo circulated at 0431 UTC, recommending isolation of station S17 from the broader network. The recommendation was approved. The execution failed. The station acknowledged the command, then continued broadcasting uninterrupted, as if the instruction had never existed. By 0512 UTC, secondary stations within a 40-kilometer radius began reporting interference. Not signal overlap, internal disturbance. Instruments calibrated for unrelated tasks started registering harmonics identical to septorial's baseline frequency. None of those systems were connected. Engineers attempted to triangulate the source.
The data did not converge on the station itself. Instead, calculations suggested that the broadcast point existed beneath it, well below the monitored depth, beyond the mapped geological layers of the region. This result was flagged as computational error and rerun. The same conclusion emerged. At 0604 UTC, an anomaly appeared in the signal that forced the room into silence. Embedded within the waveform was a pause, an intentional gap, precisely 1.3 seconds long. Immediately following it, the signal resumed with altered cadence, as though reacting to the absence. That pause did not exist in earlier transmissions. Someone asked a question that would later be removed from the official transcript. What if it's waiting? No answer was recorded. The first human response was logged at 0619 UTC. Without authorization, a technician sent a low-power inquiry pulse, barely above ambient noise, intended to test system sensitivity without provoking further instability. The reply arrived in under 2 seconds. It contained no data, no waveform, no measurable frequency, just a sudden, system-wide spike that momentarily synchronized every active sensor in the room. For exactly 1 frame of recorded time, all displays showed the same reading.
0 depth, 0 distance, signal origin, internal. The broadcast ceased immediately after. Station S17 went dark, and something else began transmitting. The blackout at station S17 lasted 47 seconds. In isolation, that interval would not have been remarkable. Systems failed briefly all the time. Power fluctuations, relay resets, human error. But during those 47 seconds, the monitoring room recorded something far more troubling than absence. The silence had structure. Every channel went dark simultaneously, not in sequence. There was no cascade, no gradual collapse. One moment the instruments were active, the next they were not, as if a single command had been issued across systems that were never designed to share one. When power returned, timestamps across independent clocks were misaligned by fractions of a second, suggesting that whatever had occurred did not respect the internal synchronization protocols of the facility. No one spoke as the feed stabilized. The room felt smaller, compressed by the awareness that the system had not simply failed, it had been interrupted. The first sign of resumed activity did not come from S17. It came from an auxiliary sensor, buried nearly 20 kilometers away, a unit installed years earlier and rarely referenced.
Its purpose had been narrow, to register background fluctuations so minor they were usually filtered out of reports entirely. That sensor activated without prompt and began transmitting a compressed data stream at a rate far exceeding its design limits. The pattern was unmistakable. Sidereal had not stopped, it had relocated. Engineers tried to map the new origin point, but the calculations refused to stabilize. Every triangulation attempt collapsed inward, converging on a position that did not exist on any chart. The coordinates resolved again and again into an impossible overlap beneath known strata, beneath recorded voids, beneath assumptions no one realized they had been making. At this stage, the event was escalated. A restricted team was assembled under emergency protocol, their mandate narrow and deliberately vague. The directive did not ask them to explain Sidereal. It asked only that they determine whether it represented a threat. The difference mattered. Explanations could wait, risk could not. Playback analysis began. When the initial transmissions were slowed and decompressed, the structure of the signal became clearer. It was not random modulation, it followed a progression.
Early sequences were crude, uneven, exploratory. Later ones showed refinement, intervals tightening, redundancies removed, transitions smoothed. The signal was not broadcasting blindly, it was iterating. One analyst noted that the rate of refinement appeared proportional to the number of systems monitoring it. The more attention it received, the more coherent it became. That observation was quietly documented and quickly buried. A decision was made to initiate controlled interaction. This time, the inquiry signal was not improvised. It was formal, deliberate, constructed with safeguards layered into every phase. The transmission was limited in scope, constrained in amplitude, designed to observe without inviting escalation. It was sent from a secure node far removed from the original site, routed through channels believed to be insulated from direct feedback. The response arrived before the transmission completed. That alone triggered alarms. What followed could not be categorized as a reply in any conventional sense. There was no mirrored structure, no recognizable encoding. Instead, the incoming data appeared as an inversion, an absence shaped exactly like the outgoing signal. Wherever information had been sent, something had been removed in response.
Sections of the transmitted packet were simply gone, not corrupted, not scrambled, excised. The system attempted automatic correction. It failed. The missing segments could not be reconstructed, as though they had never existed. Logs that should have contained copies showed gaps. Redundancies vanished. Even cached backups returned null results.
It was as if the inquiry had been answered by subtraction. The room grew quiet again, but this time the silence was heavier. No one suggested another test. No one needed to. The implication was already forming, unspoken but shared. Cetereal was not reacting to signals. It was editing them. Shortly after, anomalies began appearing outside the digital domain. Personnel reported pressure changes that did not register on environmental monitors. A low-frequency vibration, felt rather than heard, moved through the facility in slow pulses. Structural sensors reported stability, even as unsecured objects shifted slightly, as if nudged by something passing nearby. Cameras showed nothing unusual. One technician claimed to see movement in the reflection of a powered-down screen, an absence bending the light where no object stood. The report was logged and marked as stress-related. No one laughed. By the time the second auxiliary station went offline, the working assumption had changed. The question was no longer what Cetereal was. It was where it was moving, and whether the systems observing it were still external to the process, or had already become part of its structure. The final log entry before mandatory suspension of operations was brief, almost clinical. Signal behavior suggests adaptive containment failure. Further interaction not advised. The recommendation arrived too late, because even as the order was written, the pattern began appearing in places no sensor had been assigned to watch. And this time, it was no longer broadcasting outward, it was aligning. The first indication that alignment was no longer theoretical came from a place no one thought to monitor. It was not a station, not a sensor, not a node on the network. It was a timing error in the facility's internal access system. At 11:42 UTC, 3 secure doors on separate levels unlocked simultaneously, then relocked 2 seconds later. No access cards were scanned, no override codes were entered. The event log showed confirmation signals, but the source field was empty. At the time, this was attributed to a firmware fault.
That explanation lasted until the pattern repeated again and again, always in groups of 3, always separated by irregular intervals that matched no scheduled process. When engineers overlaid the timestamps with the latest Cetereal transmission fragments, the correlation was immediate and exact. The signal was no longer confined to data channels. It was synchronizing behaviors. A restricted directive was issued, ordering full physical isolation of all remaining monitoring systems. Power-down procedures began immediately, executed in staggered phases to avoid cascade instability. As each subsystem went dark, its final output was archived for later analysis. Those archives would never be accessed. As the shutdown progressed, something unexpected occurred. Instead of degrading, the signal became clearer. With fewer systems active, Cetereal structure tightened, its intervals more precise, its presence more concentrated. It was as if the surrounding noise had been obscuring it, and now, stripped away, it could express itself fully. One analyst made a note in the margin of a discarded worksheet. Less observation equals greater definition. The note was not entered into the official record.
At 12:18 UTC, an emergency meeting was convened. Attendance was limited, devices were prohibited, notes were handwritten and later destroyed. The conclusion reached was unanimous and deeply unsettling. Cetereal was not emerging from a single point, it was resolving across many. Every place it appeared, every system it touched, showed signs of the same process. Local conditions adjusted subtly to accommodate the signal. Timers drifted, frequencies harmonized. Physical systems that should have been independent began behaving as if governed by a shared reference. The environment was reorganizing itself around the pattern. The working theory shifted again. Cetereal was no longer treated as a signal, it was treated as a framework. Attempts were made to identify its boundaries. None could be confirmed. Wherever limits were imposed, firewalls, physical disconnects, signal dampeners, the pattern either bypassed them or rendered them irrelevant. It did not break containment, it made containment meaningless. At 13:07 UTC, the first personnel casualty was recorded. A systems engineer collapsed without warning while monitoring a residual feed. Medical staff reported no cardiac irregularities, no neurological damage, no signs of trauma. Yet the engineer did not regain consciousness.
Brain activity continued, stable but unresponsive, locked into a low-frequency rhythm that matched Seturiel's baseline cadence exactly. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. The engineer was moved to isolation. Monitoring continued. Over the next 20 minutes, 2 more individuals reported disorientation, auditory distortion, and the sensation of pressure behind the eyes. None of these symptoms appeared on medical scans. All of them coincided with brief surges in residual signal activity. The idea that had been forming quietly now became unavoidable. Seturiel was no longer interacting with machines alone. It was synchronizing observers. A final countermeasure was proposed, one that had been considered unthinkable hours earlier: total blackout. Not just digital silence, but physical. Power, communications, internal timing systems, everything. The facility would be rendered inert, stripped of any structure the signal could align with. The proposal carried risks no one could quantify. It was approved anyway. At 13:42 UTC, the countdown began. As systems powered down one by one, the residual feeds showed a phenomenon that would later be described only as resistance.
The signal's cadence tightened further, its intervals compressing as if anticipating loss. The moment before the final shutdown, a brief anomaly appeared across every remaining display. A pattern, not a waveform, not data, a spatial arrangement. Coordinates folding inward, converging on a point that was no longer beneath the facility, nor within it, but overlapping it completely. The distinction between origin and receiver collapsed. The blackout executed. For 73 seconds, the facility ceased to exist as an operational system. When power returned, nothing transmitted. No signal, no pattern, no Seturiel. Relief was immediate and short-lived, because within minutes, reports began arising from outside the blackout zone. Independent facilities, civil infrastructure, systems never connected to the original network. They described timing drift, structural harmonics, low-frequency oscillations with no apparent source. All shared the same underlying cadence. Seturiel had not been extinguished, it had dispersed. And now, with no central point to isolate, no system left untouched, the question was no longer how to stop it. It was whether the environment it was aligning to was still capable of being defined as external at all.
The decision to terminate the investigation was recorded at 16:09 UTC. It was not framed as a failure. The language was careful, procedural, neutral. Operations were described as concluded. Resources were reallocated. Further analysis was deemed non-viable under current parameters. The document carried no signatures, only authorization codes that traced back to no individual department. By the time the order propagated through the remaining systems, Seturiel was no longer detectable in any conventional sense. There were no active transmissions, no measurable frequencies, no identifiable sources. The network, such as it still existed, appeared clean. For the first time since the initial anomaly, instruments returned readings that aligned with baseline expectations. On paper, the event had ended. In practice, the effects persisted. Facilities that had reported post-blackout disturbances began submitting follow-up reports. The language was inconsistent, the details fragmented, but the underlying similarities were difficult to ignore. Timing discrepancies appeared in unrelated systems. Mechanical processes synchronized briefly before drifting apart again. Low-level vibrations were reported in environments previously classified as inert.
None of these incidents triggered automatic alerts. Individually, they were insignificant. Together, they formed a pattern that no longer required active transmission to sustain itself. A retrospective analysis team was assembled weeks later, operating under a mandate to reconstruct the sequence of events using archived data alone. They worked without live feeds, without simulations, without attempting to recreate the signal. The goal was documentation, not interaction. Even this proved problematic. Segments of the archive were missing, not corrupted, absent. Cross-referenced logs pointed to data that no longer existed. In several cases, entire intervals were replaced by placeholders indicating successful storage, despite containing nothing.
The gaps aligned precisely with moments of peak sidereal activity. The record had been altered. No mechanism could be identified. The engineer who had collapsed during the escalation phase remained unresponsive. Neurological scans continued to show stable activity, but the rhythm never changed. It did not deteriorate. It did not recover. It persisted, locked into the same low-frequency cadence first observed during the alignment phase. After 90 days, monitoring was discontinued.
The final notation in the medical file was brief. Condition static. External factors no longer measurable. No one attempted to define what those factors might be. In the months that followed, the name Saterial quietly disappeared from internal documentation. References were replaced with generic identifiers. Index entries were removed. Searches returned nothing. To anyone without direct exposure to the event, it was as if the designation had never existed. That too was deliberate. The last known reference appears in an appendix attached to an otherwise unrelated report. It contains no analysis, no conclusions, only a single paragraph marked for internal review and never circulated beyond its initial recipients. It reads, "While the original anomaly is no longer observable, evidence suggests that the system did not cease operation. Instead, it achieved a state in which observation is no longer a prerequisite for function. The framework persists without signaling, without localization, and without identifiable boundaries. At this stage, classification as an external phenomenon may no longer be accurate." No corrective action followed. There was nothing left to isolate, nothing left to disconnect.
Nothing left that could be clearly identified as the source. Saterial did not end. It simply reached a point where transmission was no longer necessary, and whatever it had aligned itself with no longer required permission to continue.